Hey guys, and welcome back to the second and final video in the Compass Games Learn to Play series for Grant, the Western Campaign of 1862. In this video, developer Merv Cross is going to guide us through the steps of the first two scenarios, as well as cover the optional rules in detail. So sit back and learn the rest of what it takes to succeed in Grant, the Western Campaign of 1862. Over to you, Merv.
As I've mentioned previously, I'm going to describe briefly the scenarios that John has provided in the playbook for the assaults against Fort Henry and Fort Donelson. Fort Henry does have a battery and Fort Donelson has 3 batteries. So Grant and Foote discuss the plan and they decide to send 4 Union gunboats from Paducah, is where they start, upstream towards Fort Henry. This costs them 2 movement points as they go in upstream, 4 and 6, and also due to the fact that the river space is interdicted by a battery, the gunboats have to pay an additional +5 movement points. So that's a total of 11 movement points. I strongly recommend a pen and paper to keep track of naval units, as they have larger movement allowances, and after a battle they can continue movement up to their movement allowance if they wish to do so. In the physical game, the way that we would indicate that a naval vessel has completed its movement for that particular turn, we would flip the counter over, and then that would indicate then that that counter cannot move in any further impulses. The reason I say that is, if we look at the right hand side over here, there is a transport unit at Louisville, and that unit would be activated when Buell's impulse chit was drawn. Naval units are not associated to land units, therefore they can be moved independently, but they will have to move within one of the Army's impulse chits. Now we begin the naval combat. As a reminder, the site value for Fort Henry is 0, but it does have a minor fort on site. The battery attack value is 3, but its defense value is 0. Union gunboats all have attack values of 4 and have a defensive value of 2. The Confederate battery in Fort Henry can decide which vessel it will target, and it chooses the Essex. The battery will be using the +1 column on the naval combat table. Its attack value is 3, minus the 2 of the defense value of the Essex, therefore the +1 is used. It scores 2 hits. We've got the naval hit markers here, so we'll take that from there, and that goes against the Essex. All 4 Union gunboats will now target the battery at Fort Henry. All of them, including the Essex, will be at +4 because the defensive value of Fort Henry is 0. They have to roll a 2 or better to suppress the battery, and in this case they do. The battery counter is flipped over to its suppressed side and therefore is no longer effective in that space. It ends the combat, and now we must proceed to the naval damage table. And the Essex had had 2 hits, therefore they look at the naval damage table, which is 10.2. They roll a 5 and it results in a D4. She is removed from the board and will return to play 4 turns later, as per the example on page 35 of the rules 1021, which gives a very good description of the process. So let's remove her. So now these units remain at this river space by Fort Henry. They've used 11 movement points, the 6 to get there plus the 5 because the battery interdicted on the river space. The other 3 gunships remain at Fort Henry. The Carondelet then moves to the confluence of the Cumberland and Ohio rivers in case the Confederates should get the idea of attacking downriver. Carondelet has already had 11 movement points used, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 as she's now going upstream. At this point, we've finished the movement with the Carondelet and we can flip over the counter to indicate that she has finished her movement for this game turn. The Benton and St. Louis will stay at Fort Henry in anticipation of the amphibious assault against Fort Henry. With the battery successfully suppressed at Fort Henry, Grant decides to move Smith and McClellan via transports to attack Fort Henry. Both the units have 5 strength points, and it would cost 4 movement points to embark onto the transport ships. So McClellan, then Smith. And Grant goes with him. He'll be leaving Wallace in Paducah. So they've expended 4 movement points from the 30 of the transports. 6, 8, 10 to join the Benton and St. Louis. The battery suppressed, so there's no interdiction at this point. And then they disembark to attack Fort Henry. Just remove those for now. Move that back inside. And we can flip these counters over now because they've actually ended their movement by staying there. They're going to participate in the assault here. As an aside, looking at the sequence of play, the suppressed battery can only recover its fighting strength without the need of a die roll at the end of a friendly impulse. Here, battery units recover from suppression. 10:16 and 10:15 describe it in the rulebook. And remembering, of course, that the Tennessee is the dividing line between east and west. You got the west, then you got the east with this line here, and it goes all the way down towards Muscle Shoals. So therefore, for this battery to regain its effectiveness, it would have to be during, or after rather, the Army of Central Kentucky's impulse. Once that had finished, that would be automatically reactivated. 10:16 describes what would happen if the 2 units were still in the river space. They either need to conduct combat or they need to retreat. 10:16 describes that very well. Now we can proceed to the actual ground assault against Fort Henry. So if you recall, Grant started at Paducah. He took his 2 divisions, Smith and McClellan, by transport, 4 to embark, 4 to disembark, and the 6 to move. So they've actually used 14 movement points on the 2 transport ships. So they still have 16 movement points should they choose to use them. The 2 gunships, they remain here to give gunship support to the assault. In view of the fact that they started in supply, they remain in supply. There's no supply issues for Grant. However, this will be classed as an amphibious attack, and they will be halved in strength for the first round. We always round down, so the 5 becomes 2.5, which is a 2. Therefore, they will use the 2 column of the strength points for firing in the fire combat table for the first round. Thereafter, it'll be using the 5 column. The Confederate detachment can either fight in the fort or it can choose to fight out of the fort, which gives them the option of retreating to Fort Donelson. And for this example, we've decided that that is the case. So as the Union units debark from the transport ships, the Confederate player decides that he wants to attempt a reaction move so he can retreat to Fort Donelson. The initiative table is consulted and he rolls a 7. This has to be modified by his own initiative rating of -1 and plus Grant, who's in command of the Union forces. Therefore, it's a -3 and it becomes a 4, which results in a fail. So the first round of combat must now be conducted. The Confederates are outside the fort, so they do not get any benefits of being inside the fort. They will use the +1 column of the fire combat table. So they got 1 strength points. The Union, in the meantime, they have 5 strength points, but they are halved, rounded down, which means that they will be using the 2 column. And in both cases, all the units miss. The Union has decided that he can use Grant in the combat phase, and he's decided that he will give his +1 to McClelland, who's got a 0, thus leaving Smith to fight with his own +1. Grant can become a casualty because the only way a senior leader can become a casualty is if a natural 9 is rolled. However, the firing enemy unit has to have 3 strength points to cause that potential effect of a senior leader or a divisional leader being killed or wounded in action. The gunships, just flip them over for now. Even though they've ended their moons, can't move any further. The gunships have the ability to support one division. So we've got the St. Louis that supports Smith, and we'll have the Benton to support McClelland, and they would add a +1. Gunships can support divisions in an amphibious attack, which this is. However, a maximum of 2 gunships can support divisions in any battle. So even if we had 4 gunships at that position, only 2 could participate in an amphibious attack. And also, the gunship can only support 1 unit. So the Benton, as an example, could support Smith, and the St. Louis McClelland. We now continue to the second round of combat, and the Confederate player, realizing that he's in a very, very bad position, decides that he's going to conduct a voluntary retreat towards Fort Donelson. Therefore, that presents 2 Union divisions with a free shot at the detachment, using this time the 5 column, because they are now at full strength. They're also supported by the Benton and the St. Louis. Grant, as I said earlier, was going to support McClelland. Therefore, McClelland will have a +1, plus the +1 from the St. Louis, and Smith already had a +1 for his combat value. So Smith and McClelland have an opportunity to fire at the detachment, and this results in 3 hits. So I'll just place that on the map, prepared it earlier. So the detachment has now got 3 hits. The battle has ended. The Confederate player now would consult the losses table, and he looks at the 3 hits column. The die roll will be modified by -1 due to the 3 hits, and also another -1 die roll for the losing side. So if you look at your losses table, you will note on the 3 column, regardless of whether he hits a 9 or not, he's still going to lose 1 strength point. So effectively, this eliminates this from the game. So we can delete that. And this now needs to go back up here to the attachment leaders or replacement leaders section, and we can place it back in the pot. And what you'll see is that that 4 will become a 5. In the printed game, we put it back into play as being available to the Confederate player. Grant has taken Fort Henry. Now game turn 2, and the Union player has now decided that they're going to go for Fort Donelson. But Fort Donelson's quite a tough nut to crack. So therefore, he knows that he has to suppress the 3 batteries that are present at Fort Donelson. So the Union player has drawn the Army of the Tennessee Impulse Jet. So it is Grant to go. So he's going to move the Benton and the St. Louis downstream using 3 points, and they're going to pick up the Essex, which is returned into the game, and the Cincinnati, which was a reinforcement. They will join them and continue now upstream, picking up the Carondelet, and they will continue upstream until they get to Fort Donelson. Now, Fort Donelson has got 3 batteries in there, so this now effectively starts a naval combat. And a naval combat has a maximum of 4 rounds. So now we will have a look at how the battle goes. So the battle commences. The batteries are going to target the St. Louis, the Benton and the Carondelet. The batteries will fire on the +3 column of the naval combat table. Now, as a reminder, as you can see, Fort Donelson has a sight value of 2, but it also has a minor fort. And if we look at the battery combat values chart 10.141, which is on the reverse side to the naval combat table, you will see that in a minor fort with a sight value of 2, the attack value of the battery is 5 and the defense value is 2. So the attack value of 5 is modified by the defense value of the Union gunboats. The result is that all 3 Union gunboats would receive 1 hit in this first round. So we get the naval marker, we can place 1 hit on each of these. Now it's the turn of the Union gunboats to fire at the batteries in Fort Donelson. Fort Donelson has a defense value of 2, and the gunboats have an attack value of 4. So therefore they will use the +2 column on the naval combat table. On that particular column, an 8 or a 9 would give a result of 2, and a 2 is required to suppress a battery. Therefore, if they hit a 0 or a 1, it counts for nothing. These 3 gunships, St. Louis, Benton and Carondelet, will have a -1 die roll modifier. At the end of the round, only 1 battery is suppressed. We can flip it over to its suppressed side, and then we will proceed to the second round of the naval combat. So therefore we can use this little counter to remind us exactly where we are. The 2 unsuppressed Confederate batteries can now target whichever vessels they want. And in this example, the St. Louis is going to be targeted, and so is the Essex. The St. Louis receives an additional hit, and the Essex receives 2 hits. Now we move on to the Union gunboats firing back at the 2 unsuppressed batteries at the minor fort. If you look at the naval combat table, and we'll be looking at the 2 columns specifically, you need an 8 or a 9 to inflict a suppression. Therefore, the St. Louis and the Essex cannot achieve that. So they decide to voluntarily withdraw. We withdraw naval units in the direction that they approached the battle from. So in this case, we would move it back downstream towards Paducah. And a total of 3 spaces must be entered. So it's 1, 2, 3. We'll leave the 2 hits counter with that one, and we'll do the same with the Essex with the 2 hit counter on that one. So they both sustained 2 hits. The Confederates had the choice of either conducting withdrawal fire on those units, or they can target other units. So they decided to target the Benton, the Carondelet, and both those units also receive another hit. So this effectively now puts them in a situation where they are not capable of suppressing these batteries. Players have a choice. They can either withdraw before they fire, or they'd have to conduct a fire. So in this instance, once again, the Benton and the Carondelet need to withdraw. They will do the same and go to this area. That leaves the Cincinnati with a choice of conducting this next round or also withdrawing. They choose to withdraw on this occasion. The batteries can't fire at that last 3 because they'd already fired, if you recall, at St. Louis and Essex. So this effectively now would end the naval battle, and they would then consult the naval damage table. Grant has received reinforcements after his victory at Fort Henry. It's turn 2 and the weather is light rain again. He has 3 divisions, and he will conduct a land attack towards Fort Donelson. There are 3 divisions at Fort Donelson, and they've decided to retreat into the fort to conduct the battle. This is a risk, because if they lose the battle, they will have to surrender. Grant is in supply. It's light rain. He has to judge the supply from the fort. He's got one space, and therefore he can then trace the space all the way back, uncontested, to a supply city. So Grant is in supply. Likewise, the troops at Fort Donelson are also in supply, because they can trace a supply route all the way back to Nashville. Grant will be attacking the fort, and therefore, for all the rounds, he will suffer a -2 die roll modifier on the fire combat table. He's decided that he's going to assist McClelland. McClelland has a 0 value for combat. So is Lew Wallace. And Smith will be on his own because he has a +1. Grant can add his +1 combat value to McClelland. There is no surprise, as it's a fort, along with the fact that we've just conducted a naval combat in the river space next to Fort Donelson. I've just modified things slightly. It's game turn 2. I should have flipped over the Cincinnati because she's now active. And also the transport units remain at Fort Henry, but they have brought one extra one to bring Wallace down to this area. And there is a transport ship, a Confederate transport ship that I brought into play at Fort Donelson River Space. Now, arguably, the Cincinnati could be sent in to challenge this space. However, the batteries at Fort Donelson are now fully active once again. So they're not going to risk sending one gunboat into that space, so the transport can remain there as she is protected by the batteries. So the Battle of Fort Donelson will now commence. I've placed a battle marker here as a reminder. Forgot to mention, when Fort Henry was taken, you have available a small or a large control marker. In this case, I've used the smaller one. The larger one would fill the entire space. As this is now under Union control, and will award the Union player at the end of the game 2 points. If we have a look up here, Duca, that would be 3 points per turn that the Confederate player occupies or was the last to occupy that space with an undemoralized infantry unit. So the Confederate can accumulate a lot of victory points very quickly. So the Battle of Fort Donelson will commence. We've set it up as per the playbook, and I'm not going to go through each and every die roll, but very, very quickly I will mention that there is a great player aid chart on page 8 of the playbook. And as an example, I'll go through Lew Wallace's division first. It shows him as 7 strength points. The leader die roll modifier is 0 for combat. He's attacking a fort, so therefore on every round he will have a -2 on the die roll, and he is going to be targeting Clark. He rolls a 3 on the combat results table, 7 here, 3, and that results in a hit. However, being as it's modified by -2 because of the fort die roll modifier, it becomes a 1, and therefore there's 0 hits, so it's a miss. And we do the same with all the other units. Once we've completed the first round, we establish how many hits has happened, and then we will consult the morale table if any unit has actually sustained 2 hits. As you can see, McClelland's unit suffered 1 hit. The die roll wasn't a natural 9, so we don't have to check for either of those commanders to see if they were killed or wounded in action. C.F. Smith also received a hit, as did B. Johnson. There's no negative effect at this point in time for the next round, and they don't have to check for morale because they've only sustained 1 hit. However, Buckner has sustained 2 hits. So therefore, he now has to go to the morale check table and roll to see if his unit survives or becomes demoralized. He passes. So now we're going to proceed to round 2 of the combat. Each side will stay as they are, facing the opposition that they did in the first round, for simplicity's sake. You can swap and change as you wish. Only Buckner will receive a negative die roll because he sustained 2 hits in the first round. So we follow the same modifiers that were used in the first round of combat, and now I will show you the results. The example, in the second round of combat, we use the same modifiers, remembering that all the Union units will have a -2 die roll modifier because they're attacking a fort, and Buckner will have the -1 on his die roll because he sustained 2 hits in the last round. The results were McClelland suffered 1 additional hit, and therefore he has 2. The same as Smith, he has 2 hits, and the same as Johnson. Buckner sustains 2 more hits. So all these units, McClelland, Smith and Johnson and Buckner, must now consult the morale table. Buckner fails. So Buckner now needs to be placed back in the rear of the lines with his 4 hits because he failed. The other 3, they passed and therefore can remain in the front lines. Being as Buckner failed, he is now classed as being demoralized. So let's put that unit there to remind us. We would then proceed to the third round, and McClelland and Smith are teaming up against Bushrod Johnson, and his unit sustains 4 more hits. So it's not looking good for him. He's demoralized. He will have to fall back to the rear, but remembering that all this fire is simultaneous, he had 2 hits at the beginning, so therefore he can fire back at McClelland or Smith, and he chooses Smith. He has a -1 die roll and he misses. So let's move him back. He's now in the rear and he's demoralized. Wallace fires at Clark and Clark sustains 1 hit. He doesn't have to carry out a morale check because it's his first hit. Clark now sees the futility of his position and he decides to fall back towards the transport that's in the Fort Donelson river space. All 3 Union units can now take a pot shot at him as he's retreating. They do so, and he sustains 2 more hits. So let's move Clark from here onto the map with his 3 hits. So Clark would get on board the transport ship with his 3 hits. To finish off the battle, Buckner had moved to the rear to try to rally. He uses the rally in battle column and fails. Therefore, both Confederate units are demoralized, and therefore the fort will surrender. The 2 Confederate divisions are surrendering. The Union player will get 1 victory point for each division, and they are removed from the game. They can be placed on the map in the area designated for surrendered divisions. And of course, Grant can send his famous message for unconditional surrender to the occupants of Fort Donelson. Now that the battle is over, we need to consult the losses table, and we need to look at the relevant columns on the number of hits table. McClelland will be looking at the 2 hits column, as will Smith. Clark will be hitting the 3 hits column. They have a -1 against them for the Union side, and they both sustain 1 strength point loss plus a fatigue. So we would reduce that down to a 7, and that we remove the hits, and then we'll go over here and get a fatigue marker. So both Smith and McClelland are fatigued. Wallace didn't sustain any hits, so he's still relatively fresh. So now I'm going to look at Clark. He sustained 3 hits during his retreat towards the transport ship. He consults the losses table, column 3 for the number of hits. And let's use Vassal for this. We'll select the dice here, and directly below it's given him a 6. So if we have a look at the 6 on the losses table, he has a -1 because of the hits that he's sustained, and he also has a -1 because he's lost the battle. So the 6 becomes a 4, and this results in a result of 1F. So he would also be fatigued. I can get rid of that now, and he loses a strength point. So Clark is fatigued, lost a strength point, and let's move him onto the transport ship just as a demonstration. He goes onto the transport ship. The transport ship still has a movement allowance, and we'll say that he can retreat to Nashville. So therefore, Grant has won the Battle of Fort Donelson. He can now place a Union victory marker. We have a choice. We can do the small one or the large one. I've already used the small one at Fort Henry, so let's go for the large one, and that fills the box. So that gives Grant another 2 victory points. 2/3 of his army is fatigued, and one of them, Lew Wallace, I guess will be fit to go in the next impulse. We now want to have a look at the District of Mississippi units that arrive on March 1st and March 2nd turns. Unfortunately, there's been a little bit of an oversight. The District of Mississippi's battery was not included on the list. So what I've done here is simply put it right at the bottom there. He actually arrives with the rest of Pope's army on this particular turn. On the following turn, those 2 units will join him as well. They all arrive at Commerce. I'll just move this up to Commerce. So I want to highlight the fact that Stanley arrives with 0 strength points, but at the beginning of the game there is a detachment at Commerce with 4 strength points. That is in effect Stanley's command. So once he joins the units, the detachment can be sent back to the off-map holding box, and Stanley would assume command of those troops. Hamilton had 4 points, Pope would join them. We also have a railhead, and that's for supply. The furthest that railhead can do is to get to this point here. And we also have the battery, like I've just mentioned. So the battery would move 1 movement point per turn. It would take 3 turns to get to New Madrid. Now I want to concentrate now on the Engineer of the West counter. It joins Pope's army. The only way that the Engineer of the West counter can move is if it boards a transport ship. So if we have a look at Union units, Union Naval, we'll get a transport just to highlight what I want to do. So we'll say there's a Union transport here at Commerce. The Engineers of the West would embark onto the transport, and then they would go downstream. So it costs 4 points to embark. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And when they get to that point, they're effectively now in position to begin the construction of the canal. The Engineer of the West counter is taken down to the turn record track, and it's placed 3 turns from when it was started. So there's 1, 2, 3. So on March 4 turn, the Engineer of the West will have constructed the canal. That can be flipped over, and once that's completed, we can go back and place it here. The canal space then effectively is a river space, but only for Union transports. Confederate transports can't use it. Union gunboats can't use it. It's specifically for transports. But the transport ships can carry troops. There are qualifiers in respect of the construction, and these are on turns where the weather is rain or heavy rain, the counter would be moved 1 turn ahead because they cannot proceed. The Union must occupy New Madrid with an infantry unit, and the transport unit, an empty transport unit, must occupy this river space adjacent to Hickman. If all that criteria is met, canal is classed as being successfully constructed and can be used from that point onwards. In the event that the engineers of the West are on a transport ship and a Confederate gunship manages to sink the ship, then the engineer of the West would be removed and it would be a reinforcement 3 turns later. So shall we say she was sunk on March the 1st, it would be back in play as a reinforcement at Commerce on the March 4 turn. I have to say that my view of John Pope was pretty tarnished by his infamous message to his new army back in July 1862 when he was transferred east to Virginia. Let us understand each other. I have come to you from the West, where we have always seen the backs of our enemies. Hardly inspiring words. Lee, Jackson and Longstreet certainly knocked the bluster out of him, and he was soundly defeated at the Battle of Second Manassas. But what he achieved in this particular campaign has made me think very differently about him. He did have good organisation, and it was a very, very big achievement that he achieved by doing what he did at Island Number 10, causing Island Number 10 to fall. And this changed things significantly during this campaign. Now I'm going to look at army movement. At this stage of the war, the armies were not particularly good at coordinating large movements. So if any 2 or more Confederate or Union division wish to move together, they consult the Army Movement Table, locating the Army Commander's initiative rating. So in the case of Buell, he would look at the Army Movement Table and look for the -1 column. Grant would use the +2 column, and Johnson, as an example, would use the 1 column. So shall we say that Buell rolls a 2, and I'm going to stick to that result for all the examples. So if we have a look at the Army Movement Table 22.0, you will see a 2 result would give Buell a 2 result. And what that means is that Buell's army will say that it's clear weather and he's in supply. So he would have normally 3 movement points. So he'd be able to go to there, that's 1, 2, 3. So he would have arrived at South Carrollton. He's lost 2 movement points now. So that means he can only move to there, because crossing the minor river would cost an additional movement point. Looking at Grant, Grant is over here, and he would have had a result of 0 if he'd rolled a 2. So he could move his movement allowance of 3, and if he wanted to, he could move to here and then attack Johnson and so on. Johnson, likewise, he would be looking at the 1 column, and he would have been given a result of 1. So therefore, his movement allowance for this turn would be 2. So he could move to Greenville, or he could decide to go that way, wherever he wants. Units that lose a movement point, or 2 movement points, can force march. Force marches consult the initiative table. So I'm now going to look at force march. If we recall, Buell started here, moved down to Calhoun from Horseville, and he could not get to South Carrollton because he'd had 2 movement points deducted from his allowance, looking at the -1 column on the Army Movement Table. Players can declare force march either at the beginning or at the end, and as it was the end of his movement, he declares that he's going to now try to force march 1 space. That's not movement point, it's 1 space, and he's going to try to get to South Carrollton. Force marches can only be done in clear weather or light rain, and as I mentioned earlier, it was clear weather. So an army can force march if they succeed in rolling a successful roll on the initiative table. They look at the army commander's initiative value, which is -1 in this case, and they also look at all the other units in the pack and pick out the worst initiative rating of any division commander. As you can see here, we've got 2 choices. We can go for McCook or Wood, which also give a -1. So therefore, they'd be looking at a -2 when they roll on the force march section on the initiative table. So let's say that Buell now is wanting to force march to South Carlton, and we'll use Vassal, but fate in the hands of the gods. It's a 4. So Buell looks at the chart for the initiative table and realizes that a 4 is a failure. Now, shall we say that the result was 0 or less? So if he'd had a 2, that would have become 0 or less. All the units in that stack would have become fatigued. And to compound the situation even further, they could not remove the fatigue markers placed in this impulse. They would have to wait until the following impulse and get to that section which is called regrouping. Part B, removing fatigue markers not placed in this impulse. So it would really restrict what Buell could do. But as it is, it's just a failure. Cavalry units are available as an optional rule, and I highly recommend their use. Cavalry can do 3 things that no other units can do. They can delay an enemy force, screen, and probe. So let's say Buell, it's a light rain condition, he is in supply because the railhead is there, so he can move 2 movement points, which means he can get to there in 1 and get to Johnson in 2. Forrest is in his way. So Forrest decides now that he's going to try to delay Buell's advance. He also has the option of withdrawing, following the standard rules for withdrawal, but he chooses for the delay. If we consult the cavalry delay table, there are modifiers. One is the cavalry leader's initiative rating, and the other is the enemy initiative rating. So it's a +2 here, and it's a +3 for Buell's negative rating. So shall we say he rolls a 3, and we can see a 3 would produce a 1 movement point and refit. So Forrest now consults the cavalry refit table, which is 18.5. And again, he rolls another 3. That gives a result of 1, and it says then that the cavalry refit result of 1 would be removed from play that many full turns. So he would be removed from the game for 1 full turn, not including this one. So Buell now, being as Forrest achieved a 3 result, it's got +1 movement point and a refit. We've done the refit. So Buell moves here for 1 movement point, +1 for the delay, so he cannot attack Johnson. Cavalry units can move up to 4 spaces. 1, 2, 3, 4. And unlike infantry, they cannot force march. Cavalry can retreat 2 spaces. So let's say that McCook wants to attack Forrest. Forrest decides to react and move away. And succeeds, he can move 2 spaces. McCook would then enter that space, but the cavalry would become demoralized after that retreat. We would place a demoralized marker after that retreat. Now let's look at probes. Morgan, without John's great-grandfather being present, wants to check out the strengths of the Union units. He can choose McCook, Mitchell, or Buell. He can only choose one. We are currently using the fog of war rules, so he hasn't got a clue what's in these stacks. He decides to check Buell. The modifiers are the enemy's combat value, in Buell's case it's a 0, and the combat value of the cavalry unit, and in this case it's a 0. There would be a -1 if the cavalry was probing over a bridge or a minor river. He rolls a 7. Looking at the cavalry probe table, which is 18.4, a 7+ results in an A, and that means he can see the entire stack. So as a consequence, he can see that there's 3 units in there, and there's a significant amount of troops here. So it's a very, very handy function to have. The table does have similar results to the delay table, such as the possibility of a refit, but the other values on it is just a 1 plus a refit or just a 1. And the numerical value is he can check 1 unit within the stack. So shall we say he rolled a 5 or a 6, he can see the strength points of 1 unit in that stack. So let's say he wants to go for Nelson. The player who owns Nelson would remove that and say, there you go, Nelson has got 9 strength points. Cavalry can use the screening facility. So shall we say in this particular example that Buell wants to attack Johnson at Clarksville. It's good weather and he's in supply. Johnson wants to react and move away, and in view of the fact he's got the Confederate cavalry with him, he can actually use screening. So in a normal initiative table for a reaction, we would use Johnson's own initiative rating, Buell's initiative rating, which is a negative, so that gives Johnson 2, and we get a +1 for a screening attempt. So it would be a +3. Let's say he rolls a 4, which would make it a 7. It's a success. So therefore, Johnson can move back 1 to Carbondale. Buell can then move to here. Vassal module has been improved as we go along, and John and I are very grateful to have such a knowledgeable colleague as Kevin Conway. He really knows his stuff. We are currently looking at the naval units and providing a facility to indicate the units have moved, which is standard in many Vassal games. As an example, it's moved and we have this tab. But we also have the option, which is mark ships move complete, which is highlighted in red. It stands out, so therefore it's quite easy to see even if we zoom out in Vassal. We also have a facility to show how many movement points the vessel has actually used. It's called set movement allowance left. So shall we say that this particular vessel, the standard is 30 on this one because it's a transport ship. So shall we say it's used 16 and therefore it's got 14 left. And then that will help indicate that that unit has moved, but it still has movement points left. On the printed version, of course, we have pen and paper, and that's always worked out over the many years of wargaming for me. And when the vessel completes its movement on the printed copy, then we would turn it over as such, and then that would indicate that he has no more movement points left on that particular unit. I also want to go very quickly through a few of the random events that can produce counters entering the game as a random event. We have the Arkansas and the Tennessee, and there's a possibility that those can arrive as a random event. Mines, I would highly recommend it. If I give you an example, if we place those mines in the river space next to Memphis, if a Union vessel were to enter that space, on a natural roll of a 9, the Union vessel would be sunk. In the event that it's a transport ship, as an example, and it had 10 strength points of men in that division, they would lose half their number in that event. So we need to be very, very careful that we don't get caught out by Confederate gunships or mines. Another random event is the Union Ram Fleet. It's got a big attack score of 4, but poor defense score. The mortar is an optional rule. Again, that can enhance units firing at island number 10 or forts. And the rule that covers the balloon, which helps the mortars to direct the fire a little bit more accurately, can be found in 2127. Then we have the 2 Confederate units. The Confederate units operate exactly the same: initiative, combat, morale. For all intents and purposes, the forest counter doesn't have a strength marker, but it's worth 1 strength point should it ever be involved in combat. If that strength point is lost, then the unit is removed from the game completely. Morgan cannot engage in combat. And it's worth noting that John's great-grandfather, Joseph Moss Lindsay, served with Morgan in the 2nd Kentucky Cavalry from July 1862 until the end of the war. He didn't participate in this game, so if we think about what Eric Lee Smith did with the P-Ridge game, in the event that his ancestor was killed, then the game doesn't exist, and so on. So there's no chance of that happening here because Joseph was not present during this particular campaign. This concludes the Learn to Play video for Grant. I hope you find it helpful. I do apologise for the length, but I did want to cover as much as I possibly could, as I use these Learn to Play videos a lot and find them very useful. I hope you enjoy playing the game as much as I have, and thank you for your time.